I'm Clara Preston, and for 30 years my husband Arthur and I poured our lives into building our dream restaurant. So imagine my horror when at our 30th anniversary dinner there, he raised a toast to his young mistress, our employee, calling her my guest of honor. He thought he could publicly erase me and bleed our business dry for her. He forgot this wife was also his business partner, and I was about to serve him a taste of real justice. Before I begin, thank you for listening to my story. Let me know in the comments where and what time you're tuning in from. It means more than you know. It reminds me that I'm not alone in this. And if you'd like to share your story with me, feel free to email it. I'll drop my email in the description below. Now let me tell you what really happened. 30 years. 3 decades Arthur and I had poured our blood, sweat, and a frankly terrifying amount of second mortgage money into Preston's, our little bistro that had, against all odds, blossomed into one of the city's most respected dining establishments. We'd started with 6 tables, mismatched chairs, and a shared dream. He was the charismatic frontman, the visionary with the palette. I was the quiet engine room, managing the books with an iron fist, ensuring the operations ran smoother than the hollandaise he was so famous for. At 55, I should have been looking forward to our pearl anniversary with unadulterated joy, perhaps even contemplating a well-deserved leisurely retirement. Instead, a bitter, coppery taste of suspicion had begun to coat everything. It started subtly, as these things often do. Arthur, my Arthur, also 55 but suddenly dressing like a man 20 years his junior, grew distant. Our comfortable late-night talks over a shared bottle of wine, dissecting the day's service or planning next season's menu, dwindled to curt exchanges about staffing or inventory. He became more secretive with his phone, his meetings running later, his explanations for absences becoming increasingly vague and, to my discerning ear, a little too elaborate. Then came Tiffany Monroe. Arthur had announced her hiring about 6 months ago with a forced casualness that immediately set my teeth on edge. "Clara, darling," he'd said, avoiding my eye, "I've found the most marvelous young woman to handle our guest relations and special projects. Tiffany. A real dynamo. Just what we need to freshen up our image." Tiffany, when she appeared, was indeed fresh. 30 years old, all gleaming hair, impossibly white teeth, and dresses that cost more than our weekly produce budget. Her resume, which Arthur had rather defensively thrust at me, was laughably thin, her experience in guest relations apparently consisting of a summer job hosting at a beachside cafe. Her special projects manager role seemed to involve a lot of long lunches with Arthur, liaising with potential VIP clients. She'd trill, though our profits showed no discernible uptick from these liaisons. In fact, quite the opposite. I manage the books. Always have. It's my domain, the place where numbers tell an unvarnished truth. And the numbers lately had begun to tell a very troubling story. Expenses labeled client development or promotional marketing were skyrocketing, often linked to upscale boutiques, florists I didn't recognize, even a discreet spa on the other side of town. Cash withdrawals, larger and more frequent than usual, were being made by Arthur, attributed to supplier emergencies he never elaborated on. Our bottom line, once so robust, was showing signs of a slow, inexplicable bleed. The staff, many of whom had been with us for years, noticed too. The whispers in the kitchen, the sidelong glances when Arthur would usher Tiffany into his small office for yet another strategy session, the knowing, pitying look some of the older waitresses would give me. They were like tiny paper cuts, each one drawing a little more blood from my already bruised heart. Tiffany, for her part, swanned about the restaurant as if she owned it, offering unsolicited, usually impractical advice on everything from the wine list to the flower arrangements, often contradicting decisions Clara had made, with Arthur invariably backing her up with a dismissive, "Now Clara, Tiffany has a fresh perspective. Let's hear her out." My attempts to discuss these financial irregularities or Tiffany's nebulous and expensive role with Arthur were met with a new, chilling defensiveness. "Are you questioning my business decisions, Clara?" He'd snap, his face flushing. "After all these years? Tiffany is bringing a youthful energy, connections we need. You're just threatened by her, or perhaps," and here his voice would take on a patronizing softness that was almost worse than the anger, "you're just not seeing the bigger picture anymore, dear. Maybe you're tired." Tired? I was tired. Tired of his evasions, tired of Tiffany's smug, condescending smiles, tired of the charade he was forcing us all to play. tired of the growing certainty that my husband, the man I had built a life and a thriving business with, was not only having an affair with this woman half his age but was also using our shared legacy, our restaurant, as his personal piggy bank to fund it. Our 30th anniversary loomed. Arthur, in a sudden uncharacteristic burst of sentimental enthusiasm that rang utterly false to my ears, insisted on a grand dinner. At the restaurant, of course, darling, he declared. A testament to everything we've built together. He even suggested I wear the pearl necklace he'd given me for our 20th, a piece I cherished. His sudden focus on us, on celebrating our journey, felt like a performance, a distraction. But for what? A part of me, the foolish, hopeful part that had loved this man for more than 3 decades, wanted to believe. Wanted to believe this anniversary could be a turning point, a return to something real. But the businesswoman in me, the one who saw the red ink on the ledgers and the calculating glint in Tiffany's eyes whenever she looked at Arthur, knew better. The plans for the dinner grew more elaborate, driven mostly by Arthur and, I suspected, Tiffany's unseen influence. It was to be a grand affair, key patrons invited, our adult children flying in. I found myself going through the motions, discussing menus with our chef, overseeing table arrangements, all while a cold dread settled in my soul. Arthur was too jovial, Tiffany too conspicuously present in the planning, her suggestions for the event becoming directives Arthur immediately adopted. I felt like I was preparing for my own execution rather than a celebration. He was planning something, I knew it. Something beyond just an anniversary dinner. The way he looked at me sometimes when he thought I wasn't watching was no longer with affection or even indifference, but with a strange mixture of impatience and, was it pity? Or a cold assessment. The restaurant, our restaurant, Preston's, had always been our shared stage. But as our anniversary approached, I had the sickening feeling that Arthur was about to rewrite the script entirely, casting me in a role I had never auditioned for, one that would strip me of everything I held dear. And Tiffany Monroe, his dynamo, would be waiting in the wings, ready for her starring role. Our 30th anniversary. A milestone that should have shimmered with the luster of shared years, of battles won together, of a love that had, I once believed, stood the test of time. The main dining room of Preston's, our restaurant, our legacy, was filled to capacity. Soft jazz, the kind Arthur and I used to sway to in our youth, drifted from hidden speakers. Tables were adorned with ivory linens and sprays of pale pink roses. My choice. One of the few details Chantal hadn't updated. Our adult children, Michael and Eleanor, named after my own strong mother, though I feared my daughter possessed little of her namesake's backbone these days, were there with their spouses, along with a carefully curated list of Arthur's important business contacts and a smattering of our oldest, dearest friends who looked increasingly bewildered by the evening's subtle but undeniable chill. I moved among them, a gracious hostess automaton, my smile feeling like a fragile mask threatening to crack. Arthur was in his element, expansive and charming, his arm frequently, possessively around Tiffany Monroe's waist. Tiffany, our guest relations manager, was a vision in a crimson dress that screamed, "Look at me," her laughter a little too loud, her eyes, when they met mine, holding a spark of ill-concealed triumph. She flitted about, acting more the lady of the manor than a mere employee, while our actual staff, particularly old Maria, who had been our head waitress for 20 years, shot me looks of pained sympathy. The air was thick with unspoken truths, with the cloying scent of Arthur's betrayal. He'd given me the pearl necklace as promised earlier that evening. Not with the tenderness of a husband celebrating 3 decades of partnership, but with a cursory, almost impatient gesture, his mind clearly elsewhere. "Here you go, Clara. Happy anniversary," he'd mumbled before immediately turning to answer a call on his sleek new phone. A phone, I suspected, purchased with restaurant funds designated for new kitchen equipment. The pearls felt cold against my skin. Dinner service was impeccable, a testament to the standards I had fought so hard to maintain at Preston's over the years. But the food, a special menu our chef had designed in honor of our anniversary, tasted like ash in my mouth. I watched Arthur fawning over Tiffany, refilling her champagne glass, laughing at her vapid pronouncements, while I sat at the head of our table, an increasingly isolated figurehead. Our children, Michael and Eleanor, seemed to be making a concerted effort to engage me in conversation, but their cheerfulness felt forced, their eyes darting nervously between me, their father, and Tiffany. They knew. Of course they knew. Or at least they suspected enough to be deeply uncomfortable. Then came the toast. Michael raised his glass, his voice a little shaky, and spoke of our enduring love, his words feeling like a eulogy rather than a celebration. Eleanor, ever the pragmatist, toasted to 30 years of Preston's success, carefully avoiding any mention of the marriage that underpinned it. A few old friends shared warm, genuine memories of Arthur and me in happier times, their words like balm on a raw wound. Finally, Arthur stood, tapping his glass for attention. A hush fell over the room. This was it. His moment. Our moment. I held my breath. My dearest friends, esteemed colleagues, beloved family, he began, his voice smooth as a vintage port, his eyes sweeping the room deliberately, I felt, avoiding mine until the very last. 30 years. 30 years Clara and I have journeyed together. A remarkable feat, wouldn't you agree? A smattering of polite applause. He gave me a brief, almost dismissive nod. And Preston's, our shared creation, stands as a testament to perseverance. He paused, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips. But as we celebrate the past, he continued, his voice taking on a new, almost reverent tone, we must also embrace the future. The fresh energy, the new ideas, the inspiration that propels us forward. His gaze found Tiffany, now seated at a table near the front, practically preening under his attention. He raised his glass higher. Tonight, Arthur declared, his voice ringing with a fervor I hadn't heard from him in years, a fervor once reserved for me for our dreams. I want to honor someone truly special. Someone whose vibrant spirit and unique contributions have brought a new light, a new passion, not just to our business but to my life. He beamed at Tiffany, who blushed and modestly lowered her gaze, though her eyes glittered with triumph. My blood ran cold. No, he wouldn't. Not here. Not now. So I ask you all to raise your glasses with me, Arthur boomed, his eyes finally, cruelly locking onto mine, a small victorious smile playing on his lips. To Miss Tiffany Monroe. A woman of extraordinary talent and vision, someone whose presence has become indispensable. My true muse, my guiding star, and tonight my very special guest of honor. And Clara's too, I'm sure. The room plunged into a stunned, suffocating silence. The clinking of a dropped fork sounded like a gunshot. I could feel every eye in that room on me, some pitying, some horrified, some perhaps morbidly curious. My face burned as if he had physically struck me. My own husband, on our 30th wedding anniversary in our own restaurant, surrounded by our children, friends, and loyal staff, had just publicly elevated his mistress, our employee, to a place of honor, effectively erasing me, his wife of 3 decades. He hadn't just introduced her. He had anointed her, his words a public declaration of my demotion, my irrelevance. Tiffany, meanwhile, was basking in the spotlight, offering a small demure wave to the room, her eyes flicking towards me with a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. The staff, my loyal staff, looked aghast, Maria meeting my gaze with tears welling in her own eyes before quickly looking away. Michael and Eleanor looked like they wanted the floor to swallow them whole. I don't know how I got through the rest of that hideous charade of an evening. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, with the stench of betrayal. The laughter was gone, replaced by hushed, awkward whispers. The delicious food turned to cardboard. Arthur, oblivious or simply not caring, continued to play the magnanimous host, fawning over Tiffany while I sat there, a frozen statue of public humiliation, my pearl necklace feeling like a noose around my neck. When the last guest had finally, mercifully departed, leaving behind a room heavy with the debris of a celebration that had become a wake for my marriage, I stood alone amidst the wreckage. The historian and my husband Henry used to say that empires often crumble from within, from corruption, from arrogance, from the betrayal of core values. Tonight, Arthur Preston had proven him right. He had not just betrayed me, he had betrayed everything we had ever built together. And as I looked around at the empty tables, at the wilting roses, a cold, hard resolve, as unyielding as the marble bar he so proudly polished, began to form in my heart. He thought he had erased me. He was about to learn that this guest of dishonor was far from finished. The silence in our car on the drive home from Preston's, our restaurant, now the scene of my most public and profound humiliation, was a thick, suffocating shroud. Arthur, my husband of 30 years, hummed a jaunty little tune, the same one Tiffany had been giggling at earlier, utterly oblivious or perhaps deliberately indifferent, to the chasm he had just blasted through our lives. I said nothing. What was there to say? He had made his pronouncement, his public anointing of his mistress, his casual erasure of me. The woman beside him was no longer his wife, his partner, the co-builder of his precious restaurant. I was a ghost, a relic he was already consigning to the past. Our children, Michael and Eleanor, had been aghast, their faces pale with shock and embarrassment throughout the latter half of that grotesque celebration. They'd offered stammered, awkward goodbyes, unable to meet my eyes, scurrying away as quickly as possible, leaving me to endure the final silent drive home with the architect of my disgrace. Once inside our house, a house that now felt as cold and alien as Arthur himself, he'd poured himself a large brandy, still humming. "Well," he'd said with an air of false joviality that made my skin crawl, "I think that went rather well, don't you? Tiffany was a hit. Adds a certain sparkle." I didn't grace him with a response. I walked past him, up the stairs to our bedroom. My bedroom now, I silently corrected, and locked the door. The fury, a cold, clear, diamond-hard rage, was beginning to push through the initial shock and devastation. This wasn't just about a cheating husband. This was about a business partner actively, brazenly destroying what we had built together, siphoning off its lifeblood for his tawdry affair, and expecting me to just fade away. He thought me weak, perhaps. A 55-year-old woman, easily discarded. He had forgotten who I was. He had forgotten the Clara Preston who had balanced the books from our tiny kitchen table in the early days, who had negotiated with tough suppliers when he was too artistic to bother, who had pored over profit and loss statements late into the night while he basked in the glow of being restaurateur Arthur Preston. He had forgotten that I, too, was Preston's, its heart, its mind, its meticulous financial guardian. That night, sleep was an impossibility. My mind, usually a calm repository of historical facts or culinary costings, was a raging inferno of calculations. The marital waste, a term I'd read in some forgotten magazine article about messy divorces, wasn't just the emotional devastation. It was the tangible, quantifiable theft from our shared enterprise. Tiffany's inflated salary for her non-job. The client entertainment expenses that always seemed to involve five-star hotels and designer boutiques. The unexplained cash withdrawals. For months, I'd noted these discrepancies with a growing unease. My queries to Arthur met with dismissive waves of his hand or accusations that I was stifling creativity, or didn't understand modern marketing. Now I understood all too well. By dawn, my fury had found its focus. It was no longer the wild, wounded rage of a betrayed wife, but the cold, analytical anger of a businesswoman whose partner was committing fraud. My personal heartbreak was immense, a chasm that might never truly heal. But my professional pride, my decades of hard work, my stake in Preston's, those were things I would fight for with every ounce of strength and intellect I possessed. I didn't confront Arthur again immediately. What was the point? He had shown his hand, his utter lack of remorse or respect. Instead, I went to my home office, a small, neat room he rarely entered, considering it my boring paperwork den. This den was about to become my war room. For years, I had maintained duplicate copies of key financial records for the restaurant, a habit born not of suspicion initially but of a meticulous nature. Now those records were my arsenal. I spread them out. Profit and loss statements, supplier invoices, payroll records, credit card statements for the business accounts Arthur primarily used. I started a new ledger, a private one just for this. My pen moved with a steady, relentless precision, cross-referencing, highlighting, calculating. The patterns of his deceit, once subtle anxieties, now leaped from the pages with glaring clarity. Tiffany Monroe's salary for a guest relations manager, who rarely seemed to relate to any guests beyond Arthur himself, was nearly double that of our experienced maitre d'. Promotional trips to wine regions that coincided perfectly with Tiffany's Instagram posts from luxury spa resorts. Emergency supplier payments in cash with no corresponding invoices. The restaurant, our dream, was being bled dry to fund his midlife crisis and his mistress's expensive tastes. The more I uncovered, the colder and more resolute I became. This wasn't just an affair. This was systematic theft. This was a deliberate dismantling of our shared future for his selfish, immediate gratification. He hadn't just humiliated me, he had defrauded me. By the end of that first day of my silent investigation, I knew two things with absolute certainty. First, my marriage was over, irrevocably shattered. Second, Arthur Preston was not going to get away with destroying our life's work. He had called me his guest of honor's supporter. He was about to find out what it meant to face a co-owner who had just audited the full, devastating cost of his betrayal. My next step was clear. I needed the best damn divorce lawyer in the city, someone who specialized in unraveling financial deceptions and fighting for a wronged partner's rightful share. Arthur thought he had all the power, all the sparkle. He was about to learn about the unyielding power of documented truth. The days following my confrontation with Arthur and his subsequent arrogant dismissal of my pain and our partnership were a blur of cold fury and meticulous, painstaking work. He carried on as if nothing had happened, parading Tiffany around our restaurant, Preston's, with an even more pronounced air of ownership, while I, his wife and co-founder, became a ghost in my own establishment, a silent observer watching him bleed our legacy dry. But my silence was no longer born of shock or fear. It was the calculated quiet of a predator stalking its prey. My home office, once a sanctuary for quiet thought and menu planning, transformed into a war room. My years of managing the restaurant's finances, of scrutinizing every invoice and balancing every ledger, now served a new, grim purpose. I delved into the accounts with a historian's precision and a wronged woman's thirst for truth. The evidence of Arthur's profligacy and deceit, particularly concerning Tiffany Monroe, was more damning than even my worst suspicions had painted. Her salary, under the ludicrous title of Director of Ambience and Client Experience, a role Arthur had invented on the spot, was nearly triple that of our head chef, a man with decades of experience and critical acclaim. Her expense reports, rubber-stamped by Arthur, were a litany of designer boutique purchases, new uniforms for client-facing roles, he'd once vaguely explained, spa treatments, essential for maintaining a stress-free client interface, and five-star hotel stays in nearby cities for networking opportunities that never seemed to yield a single new corporate account. Credit card statements for the business account Arthur controlled showed a hemorrhage of funds. Extravagant dinners at rival restaurants with Tiffany as his only client, jewelry store charges listed under corporate gifts, even payments to a luxury car lease company for a vehicle I'd never seen used for restaurant business. It was all there, a sickening trail of marital funds being systematically diverted to support his affair and Tiffany's lavish lifestyle. He wasn't just cheating on me, he was actively defrauding the business we had poured our lives into, jeopardizing its future and by extension my own. Each uncovered transaction, each falsified expense, added another layer of ice to my resolve. After 2 weeks of intense, secret auditing, compiling spreadsheets, cross-referencing receipts with Tiffany's boastful social media posts, she wasn't exactly discreet about her good fortune. I had a dossier thick enough to choke a horse. It was time for the next step. I needed a lawyer, not just any lawyer, but someone formidable, someone who specialized in contentious divorces and unraveling complex financial deceptions. My research led me to Diane Warren, a name whispered with respect and a touch of fear in legal circles. She was known for her sharp intellect, her meticulous preparation, and her refusal to be intimidated. Her an-hour fee was astronomical, but looking at the figures Arthur had been siphoning, I considered it an investment in my survival. I made the appointment under an assumed name, a precaution against Arthur somehow finding out prematurely. Walking into her sleek, modern office, I felt a strange mixture of trepidation and empowerment. Ms. Warren was exactly as described, impeccably dressed, her gaze direct and analytical, exuding an air of quiet, confident authority. I laid out my story, starting with the public humiliation at our anniversary dinner, Arthur's defiant confirmation of his affair, and then the core of my findings, the meticulously documented financial hemorrhage from our restaurant to fund Tiffany Monroe. I presented my spreadsheets, the highlighted credit card statements, copies of Tiffany's flimsy employment contract versus her actual, non-duties, and even a few discreetly obtained photos of Arthur and Tiffany on one of their business trips that looked suspiciously like a romantic getaway. Ms. Warren listened intently, her expression unreadable at first. She occasionally asked a sharp, pertinent question, her eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips. "Mrs. Preston," she said, her voice calm but with an underlying current of steel, Your husband is not just an adulterer. He is, by the evidence you've presented, a remarkably foolish and brazen embezzler of marital assets. Your meticulous record-keeping is extraordinary. This isn't just grounds for divorce. This is a clear case of significant dissipation of assets and potentially corporate malfeasance. A wave of validation washed over me. I wasn't just a jealous, overwrought wife. I was a defrauded business partner. What are my options? I asked, my voice steady. Our first step, Ms. Warren explained, is to file for divorce, citing adultery and irreconcilable differences. Simultaneously, we will file a motion to freeze all marital assets, including business accounts, to prevent further dissipation. We will petition for full forensic accounting of the restaurant, going back several years. We will make a strong claim for an unequal distribution of assets in your favor to compensate for the funds he has clearly wasted on Miss Monroe. And Mrs. Preston, she added, her eyes meeting mine, given your integral role in building and managing Preston's and his gross mismanagement, we will fight for you to gain controlling interest if not sole ownership of the restaurant. Sole ownership. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Preston's without Arthur? It was almost unimaginable. Yet the alternative, allowing him to continue to run it into the ground while flaunting his affair, was even more so. And Tiffany Monroe? I asked. Once we have established clear financial misconduct involving her employment and benefits, her position at the restaurant will become legally untenable, especially if you gain control, Ms. Warren said coolly. Consider her a liability that will be managed. I took a deep breath. The path ahead was going to be a battle, ugly and undoubtedly painful. Arthur would fight, I knew that. He would be furious, vindictive. But for the first time since that horrible anniversary dinner, I felt a flicker of genuine hope. I had truth on my side, meticulously documented. And I had Diane Warren. Ms. Warren, I said, meeting her gaze with a newfound resolve. Proceed. I want to fight for everything I've worked for everything he has tried to take from me. She nodded, a glint of admiration in her eyes. Excellent, Mrs. Preston. Now let's discuss strategy. It's crucial your husband remains unaware of these steps for as long as possible. We need to prepare our filings meticulously before he has a chance to hide further assets or retaliate. So began the next phase of my secret war. Outwardly, I continued to play the part of the subdued, heartbroken wife, enduring Arthur's presence at the restaurant, his casual cruelties, his ongoing affair with Tiffany. But inwardly, I was a woman preparing for battle, armed with evidence, guided by legal expertise, and fueled by a righteous fury that had finally found its focus. The countdown to serving Arthur his just deserts had begun. The weeks following my initial consultation with Diane Warren were a strange duality. To the outside world, and particularly to Arthur and Tiffany, I was still Clara Preston, the quietly grieving, perhaps slightly diminished wife. I continued my duties at Preston's, a ghost at the feast of their ongoing arrogance, my polite smiles and subdued demeanor a carefully constructed facade. Tiffany still swanned about, her director of ambience title a daily insult. Arthur still signed off on her ludicrous expenses with a flourish. They had no idea that each evening in the solitude of my home office, I was a general plotting her campaign, meticulously reviewing documents with Ms. Warren's paralegal, preparing for the moment the first volley would be fired. Ms. Warren was a marvel of efficiency and steely resolve. She had, with my input, drafted a divorce petition so thorough, so damning in its detailing of Arthur's adultery, his calculated public humiliation of me, the evidence of the slap he'd delivered, and most significantly, the systematic dissipation of our marital assets through the restaurant to fund his affair, that it read like a prosecutor's closing argument. A forensic accountant engaged by Ms. Warren had already begun a deeper dive, confirming my initial findings and unearthing even more instances of Arthur's financial recklessness benefiting Tiffany. The day for Arthur to be served was chosen with strategic precision. It was a busy Friday afternoon at Preston's, when the lunch rush was winding down but before the evening preparations began in earnest. Arthur was in his element, schmoozing with a few regular patrons at the bar, Tiffany draped decoratively over a nearby stool, laughing a little too loudly at one of his tired jokes. I was in the back office, ostensibly reviewing invoices, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Ms. Warren had advised I not be present for the actual service, to avoid any potential confrontation escalating. A discreet, professional process server, a man built like a polite but immovable oak tree, entered the restaurant. I heard Maria, our head waitress, gasp softly, then a sudden sharp silence fall over the usually bustling bar area. I didn't see it, but Maria recounted it to me later, her eyes wide. The process server had approached Arthur, calmly stated his name and handed him the thick envelope. Arthur, initially looking annoyed at the interruption, had taken it, a confused frown on his face. As he'd scanned the first page, the color had drained from his ruddy cheeks, replaced by a ghastly mottled pallor. Tiffany, sensing drama, had peered over his shoulder, her perfectly made-up face contorting in disbelief, then fury. "What is this nonsense, Arthur?" she'd reportedly shrieked, loud enough for the remaining patrons and all the staff to hear. "She's suing you? For what?" "Her restaurant." Arthur, for once, had been rendered speechless, staring at the papers as if they were a venomous snake. The process server, his duty done, had simply turned and walked out. The immediate fallout was a contained explosion. Arthur, once he found his voice, had apparently stormed into the back office, not mine, but the main restaurant office, demanding to know where I was, roaring about betrayal and scheming old women. I wasn't there. I had already slipped out the back as per Ms. Warren's instructions, and was safely at my sister's house. The days that followed were a barrage of furious, incoherent voicemails from Arthur, alternating between threats, pathetic attempts at gaslighting, "You're confused, Clara, you don't know what you're doing," and even more pathetic pleas for me to stop this madness. Tiffany, I heard, was beside herself, her important position at the restaurant suddenly under threat, her access to Arthur's, expense account likely frozen by the initial court orders Ms. Warren had swiftly obtained. The legal battle truly began with the depositions. Ms. Warren had warned me they would be unpleasant, and she was right. Arthur's lawyer, a slick, aggressive man clearly chosen for his ability to bully, tried to paint me as a bitter, jealous and incompetent old woman, out to destroy a successful man out of spite. But Ms. Warren, with her icy calm and rapier-sharp intellect, dismantled him. She presented my meticulous records, the forensic accountant's damning report, and my clear, unwavering testimony about the anniversary dinner humiliation and the slap that had followed. Arthur's deposition, I was told, was a disaster for him. Under Ms. Warren's relentless, precise questioning, his bluster crumbled. He contradicted himself, couldn't explain the extravagant expenses for Tiffany, and his claims that he was the sole genius behind Preston's success fell apart when faced with years of financial records clearly showing my managerial and fiscal prudence. Tiffany's deposition was even more illuminating. Dressed in borrowed finery, her own accounts likely being scrutinized, she struggled to articulate her actual job duties, her qualifications, or why her client meetings so often took place at luxury spas or international resorts. Under oath, her carefully constructed facade of a dynamic professional dissolved, revealing a shallow, grasping opportunist. Some of our long-term staff, encouraged by Ms. Warren's team and finally feeling safe to speak out, provided affidavits detailing the blatant affair, Tiffany's unprofessional behavior and Arthur's clear misuse of restaurant resources to impress her. Word of the scandalous divorce and the accusations of fraud began to leak out into the tight-knit restaurant community and among Arthur's social circle. The rich friends he had been so desperate to impress by humiliating me at our anniversary dinner were now, I heard, giving him a very wide berth. His world, built on a foundation of deceit in my hard work, was visibly starting to burn. The stress was clearly getting to him. He looked haggard, his expensive suits ill-fitting, his charm entirely gone, replaced by a hunted, desperate look. Throughout it all, I focused on the restaurant, what was left of it after his plundering. With Arthur's spending curtailed by court order and Tiffany effectively barred from the premises pending the divorce outcome, I began, with the help of Ms. Warren and my loyal staff, the painstaking process of damage control, of trying to salvage the business I loved. It was an exhausting, emotionally draining battle, but with each small victory, each piece of evidence that brought the truth further into the light, my resolve strengthened. He had called me nothing without him. He was about to learn just how much this nothing could take. The final judgment was approaching, and I felt a grim, steely anticipation. Justice, like a well-prepared meal, was best served thoroughly. The final day in court felt like the culmination of a lifetime condensed into a few agonizing hours. I sat beside Ms. Warren, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, my back straight despite the weariness that had settled deep into my bones. Arthur was across the aisle, a shadow of his former arrogant self. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame, his face was pale and drawn, and he avoided my gaze, staring instead at the polished wood of the defendant's table. Tiffany Monroe was nowhere to be seen. Her role in this drama, her testimony under Ms. Warren's sharp cross-examination having exposed her as little more than a greedy opportunist, was mercifully over. The courtroom was quiet, the air thick with anticipation. Judge Harrison, a woman whose stern demeanor was tempered by eyes that missed nothing, reviewed the final submissions. She had listened patiently through weeks of testimony, through the meticulous presentation of financial records, the damning evidence of lavish spending on Tiffany from our restaurant's accounts, the painful recounting of the anniversary dinner humiliation, and the quiet, firm testimony about the slap Arthur had delivered in his rage. Finally, she looked up, her gaze resting on Arthur, then on me. "This court," Judge Harrison began, her voice clear and carrying, "has reviewed extensive evidence pertaining to the dissolution of the marriage of Clara Preston and Arthur Preston, and the division of marital assets, including the jointly owned business known heretofore as Preston's." She summarized Arthur's long-term affair with Miss Monroe, his calculated and cruel public humiliation of me at our 30th anniversary dinner, and then, her voice taking on a sharper edge, she detailed the significant and clearly documented dissipation of marital assets, the siphoning of funds from our restaurant to support his extramarital relationship. She noted my own substantial contributions to the business's creation and decades of successful operation, contrasting it with Arthur's recent gross financial mismanagement and breach of fiduciary duty to our shared enterprise. She also acknowledged the evidence of physical abuse. My breath hitched. This was it. Given Mr. Preston's egregious conduct, the judge continued, his clear and sustained pattern of adultery, the profound emotional distress and public humiliation inflicted upon Mrs. Preston, and particularly the substantial marital waste proven to have been funneled from their shared business for non-marital purposes, this court finds it necessary to make an unequal distribution of assets to achieve an equitable outcome. Arthur slumped slightly in his chair. Therefore, Judge Harrison declared, her gaze firm, the divorce is granted. A permanent restraining order is issued, prohibiting Mr. Preston from contacting or approaching Mrs. Preston. Regarding the primary marital asset, the restaurant known as Preston's, in light of Mr. Preston's demonstrated financial irresponsibility and misuse of business funds, and to compensate Mrs. Preston for the significant assets dissipated by Mr. Preston, the court awards sole ownership and all controlling interest of the restaurant business, including all its assets and liabilities, to Mrs. Clara Preston. A gasp escaped me. Sole ownership. Not just a controlling interest, but everything. My restaurant. My life's work. My tears welled in my eyes, not of sorrow this time, but of overwhelming relief and a fierce, vindicated joy. The judge continued, outlining that Arthur would receive a minimal, strictly defined settlement from other, much smaller joint assets, barely enough to keep him afloat, certainly not enough to fund any semblance of the lavish lifestyle he had enjoyed at my expense. His reputation, already in tatters within our community and the restaurant industry, was now formally sealed by a judge's public condemnation. Arthur's reaction was a study in defeated rage. He looked as if he'd been physically struck, his face ashen, his eyes darting around wildly before settling on me with a look of pure, impotent fury. But there was nothing he could do. The gavel fell metaphorically and almost literally on his life of deceit. The first thing I did as sole proprietor of Clara's at Preston Place, yes, I decided on a slight name change to mark the new era, was to instruct my new restaurant manager, Maria, my loyal head waitress, promoted with a significant raise, to issue Tiffany Monroe her final paycheck and a termination letter, effective immediately. I heard later she didn't take it well, but her theatrics were no longer my concern. Walking back into my restaurant that afternoon was like breathing fresh air after being trapped in a smoky room for years. The staff, who had endured months of tension and uncertainty, greeted me with genuine smiles and quiet words of support. There was a new energy in the air, a sense of liberation that was almost palpable. The weeks that followed were filled with hard work, but it was joyful work. I pored over the books again, this time not to find evidence of betrayal, but to strategize, to rebuild, to infuse Preston's, Clara's, with my own vision, my own values. I reconnected with old suppliers Arthur had dismissed, brought back customer favorites he had disdained, and focused on quality, integrity, and a warm, welcoming atmosphere. The scars of Arthur's betrayal would always be there, a reminder of how close I had come to losing everything. But they no longer defined me. I was Clara Preston, restaurateur, survivor, a 55-year-old woman who had faced down her husband's public humiliation and financial ruin and had not just endured, but had triumphed. My granny's truth, I suppose, was that sometimes the most devastating betrayals can forge the most unshakable strength, and that knowing your worth and being willing to fight for it with every ounce of your intelligence and resolve is the most satisfying victory of all. The restaurant thrived, and for the first time in a very long time so did I. My future was finally my own, seasoned with justice and served on a platter of my own making.